let's move on with our first interactive panel of the morning on sustainable supply chains. Now, let me welcome our panel of guests. First of all, we're joined by Claire Woodford, VP of Sustainability and Impact at Alpine Group. Also with us, Kelsey Deutscher, Supply Chain Performance Leader at TasNetworks. Also with us, Kanish Negi, Sustainability Procurement Director at Schneider Electric. And finally, Maureen O'Shea, Sustainability and Supply Chain Partner at Baringa. Hello to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi there.
Hello.
Good to see you. Good to see you all. Right, there is so much for me to cover off over the next sort of 40 minutes or so. So where I'm going to start is with some context, because that always seems like a very logical place to start. Claire, you are first on my list, so the pleasure of kicking things off will be for you. And for you, what does a truly sustainable supply chain look like for you? And second part to that, why is it so important? Claire.
Well, thank you. Very good question. Just to set the context, Alpine Group, it's an end-to-end material science, innovation and apparel manufacturing group. So we very much focus on the fashion industry. And I think we would certainly say that it is a broken system. I think it's frightening to think the fashion industry produces 10% of global carbon emissions. That's actually as much as the emissions generated by the European Union. We've got a significant problem of textile waste going into landfill every year. I don't think many people realise on average synthetic materials take around 400 years to biodegrade, let alone, about 500,000 tonnes of microfibers going into the ocean each year. That's equivalent to about 50 billion plastic bottles, and without action this could rise to about 50% by 2030. So let alone then all the kind of exploitative labour practices as well. So there's a lot we need to do, and I think when it comes to a truly sustainable fashion supply chain and what that looks like, because it's so fragmented, there's many things we need to do. But I think certainly for us, starting with raw material sourcing and production, the use of regenerative materials, for example, that's really important for us in our supply chain. We spend a lot of time and investment focusing on sustainable material innovation. We have a number of partners. So, for example, we have a partner called Nanolose. Their fibre is sustainably grown from microbial cellulose. Another partner, materials made from seaweed. So I think for us, that regenerative materials supplemented by greater supply chain transparency through the implementation of traceability tools, including blockchain, that helps us to ensure materials and products are ethically sourced. And then coupled with ethical manufacturing, again, very important that our factories operate under fair labour conditions, focusing on important items like providing fair living wages. That isn't always as easy as it sounds. Health and safety, that's obviously a priority, ensuring no child or forced labour is occurring through the supply chain, as well as things like investments into, efficient energy production, be that solar, wind, biomass. And of course, we've focused on circularity and waste reduction, end-of-life strategies, making sure products are built for durability as well. And certainly in the fashion industry, it's incredibly urgent for us. There is so much regulatory pressure changing the industry, especially in Europe with things like the EU CSDDD, the German Supply Chain Act, really aiming to hold companies accountable for human rights and environmental impacts, as well as, of course, business resilience and consumer demand, especially with our buyers expecting increased ethical, transparent and circular models as well. So really for us, a sustainable supply chain, it's not just about compliance and box ticking, but it's about ethical, well-run factories that can help to future-proof the fashion industry.
Thank you, Claire. You've taken us from top to bottom of that supply chain in about 90 seconds. So if I was wearing a hat, I would take it off to you right now. Kelsey, if I can come to you next, please. For you, what does a truly sustainable supply chain look like for you?
Given that we are geographically isolated, based in Tasmania, work for a energy distribution and transmission business, a lot of our materials that we source are very long lead time and long life materials. So for me, it's taking that life cycle cost view rather than the traditional total cost of ownership, what we can do to reuse, recycle at the back end once that 60, 70-year lifespan of our materials has expired.
Absolutely, you do have those unique challenges in Tasmania. Yeah. Thank you, Kelsey. Kanish, if I can come to you next, your thoughts on that. What a truly sustainable supply chain looks like for you.
Thank you, Neil. So, a truly sustainable supply chain for us is one which is extremely cautious and aware of the impact that it creates on the operating ecosystem. and doesn't only use the narrow financial performance criteria to assess its overall performance and the impact. A sustainable supply chain, it tries to assess or ascertain the true cost, which is paid in terms of the benefits and the services which are extracted from the ecosystem, from the environment, from the society, and compares it with the value that is being generated. And then we are tracking the efforts or making the efforts to onboard the stakeholders to create a shift in our traditional working models. So how does it translate in terms of the operations of Schneider Electric? Essentially, there are key elements of our supply chain, a thematic area focus on decarbonization, not just our own operations, but our suppliers, making sure they are transitioning to a low carbon trajectory. They are using renewable energy more and more, and we have a dedicated program onboarding, engaging 1,000 suppliers towards decarbonization. Human rights is another strong pillar. Most of our supply chain is industrial. So worker rights, working conditions, these are some of the areas which are extremely close and material for the sector in which we operate. And this is another area where we have multiple programs segmenting suppliers according to their exposure, according to the geographical reach where they are, and engaging with them, let's say meeting them at their level and then trying to raise the standards of living. And last but not the least, since we are manufacturing a lot of products and putting in the market, resource and circularity is an extremely important element or cornerstone for our sustainability strategy in our supply chain. The emphasis is on reducing the extraction of virgin raw materials, having more and more recycled content in our raw materials, engaging with our suppliers to come up with new types of materials, some things which are not available off the shelf, and it generally has a long gestation period, so that we can have these alternate materials which are much lower in its impact on both the society as well as the environment. And why is it important for us? Well, I think it's extremely clear that we are seeing the impact of breach of multiple planetary thresholds. I mean, as of 2023, I mean, the research report by the Stockholm Resilience Center, 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries were already breached. We are seeing the impact on our day-to-day lives. And as a, let's say, repercussion of that, there is an increasing array of regulatory instruments which are being introduced. There is a much heightened awareness amongst the customers, amongst the investors, and there is in general a much higher demand for corporate accountability, not just their own operations, which is a small portion of overall impact, but across the ecosystem to quantify those impacts, reduce and mitigate those impacts, and not just, let's say, reduce the harm, but rather try to create a positive impact and give back more than what we are extracting from the planet. I'll pause there, Neil, and let you go to the other panelists.
Thank you, Kanish. You've set up so many of the other elements that I want to discuss over the next half an hour or so. So thank you for that. And last but not least, Maureen, lovely to see you again. Let's go to you from a consultation point of view here. For you, a truly sustainable supply chain, what does it look like for you?
I suppose the thing that excites me most about sustainable supply chains is their role as an impact multiplier. So lots of responsible companies are taking good care within their own operations, within their own facilities, within their own small scope. But the ones that are really making a difference are engaging in a sustainable supply chain right the way back upstream. They're taking their intent and they're multiplying that across 10, 20, 100 companies that they work with. They're rising the bar as what they consider acceptable about how materials are extracted, about labour practices, about carbon, about circularity. So for me, that's the real game changer of sustainable procurement and of the sustainable supply chain work, because you're taking your intent and you're multiplying it right through the supply chain. And the most impressive companies I've seen in this have taken their name, their brand name, and really engaged with multiple other companies to be an agent for change. So I think that's why this is such an exciting space.
Yeah, that ripple effect is absolutely huge. Thank you all for that opening answer. Let's move on to impact, because something that comes up time and again in these discussions is the relationship between sustainability and business value, the fact they are intrinsically linked. Kelsey, if I can start with you on this for you, how do sustainable supply chains both benefit the environment and the business involved? How does it benefit you at Tas Networks? Make that link for us.
I think it's particularly an intrinsic link with Tas Networks. We do generate only green energy here in Tasmania, and we are the business that's responsible for distribution and transmission of that energy. There is a very green mentality here in Tasmania as well, so there's a very high expectation from our local communities and our stakeholders to maintain that green image legitimately. Ultimately, though, the environmental benefits that we're trying to maintain are the reduced carbon footprint. So sustainable supply chains often involve reducing energy consumption. We're doing that as much as we can internally. We're electric vehicles for our carpools, solar panels on our roofs. Reduce pollution where possible. We source from local businesses, so I think we are a little bit lucky there is the fact that our focus on green and local, it actually benefits our community directly and our suppliers.
I love the fact you've mentioned the importance of the local community as well. Absolutely. Kanishk, if I can come to you next. For you, how do you make that link between sustainable supply chains benefiting both the environment and the businesses involved? Make that link for us again, please.
And I think it's important to look at these links in specifics rather than a very generic overview. So I'll take a couple of different lenses. So when we talk about decarbonization, 5 years back in 2021, almost 5 years, we started a program where we onboarded more than 1,000 of our suppliers around the world on the decarbonization journey, on the Zero Carbon Project. And between 2021 and now, we have had several instances where our suppliers have improved their operational efficiency, they've reduced their energy wastages, they've plugged their energy leakages. And this is something which is really the first step, the very basic step onto the decarbonization roadmap that we provided to our suppliers. And they have had extremely tangible, direct savings in their operational cost by implementing these figures. And these were some things for which they didn't even have to invest anything. It was just tightening up the screws in their routine operational way of work, and you have these savings. So that's one of the lenses. Secondly, when we look at the transition to renewable energy, which is extremely, extremely important for the climate transition, it has hedged a lot of our suppliers against the uncertainties of the energy markets, be it the cost, be it the supplies or the quality of power which is being received, which also has an impact on the manufacturing output. So that is another area where a lot of our suppliers have seen tremendous benefit and an improvement when it comes to the traditional way of working vis-a-vis the new focus and the efforts. Let's switch to the topic of human rights. Now, again, some of the common malpractices like excessive overtime. There are in the world where it's very common because of various socioeconomic or cultural reasons to work beyond the regulatory, hours or hours which are permitted by the regulations. Now, generally, these kinds of instances are accepted, within the geography because, this is how the things get done, etc., etc. But in our experience, we found out that if we really try to address them, there is a direct correlation with respect to the operational efficiency, with respect to the on-time delivery, with respect to the improved cycle time in terms of your manufacturing output, in terms of the volumes that you are generating. So all of it translates by working lesser hours rather than more. You're actually having a better commercial performance, a higher production output, and you're actually saving more money and making more money rather than traditionally, spending long hours and violating the laws and also let's say making life difficult for a lot of people around you. And then, last but not the least, if you look at from the supplier perspective, apart from the savings and the improvement in their operational side, all these requirements, if you see in the last 10 to 15 years, there are huge number of legislations, regulations that are being introduced. And incidentally, these elements are common across all these regulations. So when a supplier goes out in the market and says, I already have these programs in place, I already have these controls in place, they are a preferred supplier for not only Schneider Electric, but a lot of other companies, let's say, who are obligated by these regulations, who are obligated by these instruments to pick up a supplier, to select a supplier who is having a preferred performance on these parameters. So our suppliers unlock a new market segment, they reach out a new customer segment just because they have a better performance, they have a better edge. In simple terms, almost everybody pitches their business in terms of cost, in terms of quality, but sustainability now we see is the differentiator between the two businesses when you have a like-to-like comparison. And this, for us as a corporation, it means a much more stable, a much more efficient, reliable, and resilient supply base that we know is robust, is strong enough, and let's say future-proof, either from regulatory perspective or from any of the shocks that we can cover with the reasonable efforts. I'll pause at that, Neil, and hand over to you.
Thank you. And that's a fantastic example. And again, it's the ripple effect that Maureen was mentioning in her first answer. So Maureen, I'll bring you in here on your thoughts about linking to business outcomes and business success. Your thoughts?
I thought Kinetic gave a really, really good answer there, because fundamentally, you start with sort of the green gold. The first steps that a company takes in their sustainability journey tend to be reducing waste, reducing mileage, all of which impact the bottom line as well as their carbon footprint. But I thought he also landed another point that often isn't talked about, and it's competitive advantage. So he's absolutely right. Leading companies now in their scoring matrix for allocating business include sustainability. So companies who are ahead of the curve on this are making themselves a more attractive commercial proposition. Another thing that we're all aware is coming out, there will be more carbon taxes, there will be more tariffs, there will be more regulatory pressure. So the companies who are getting ahead of the curve on this are future-proofing their business for tomorrow. They're gathering cost savings now, and they're making themselves more attractive in the market.
As much as I hate using the expression, it's the direction of travel, which is a horrible, horrible cliche for which I apologise for, but it couldn't be more relevant in this area. Claire, your thoughts, final word on this particular question.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on the piece around competitive advantage, I think that's a really interesting point, especially, in the fashion industry, there is so much pressure from brands on the supply chain at the moment to obviously look at their environmental impact, their social compliance and whatnot. And we're having a lot of conversation with our brands because actually we're making a lot of investments into these areas, be that decarbonisation, looking at our, waste and circularity strategy, so much emphasis on social compliance, but above and beyond, the auditing process and what else are we doing to really improve the lives of our team members? How do you translate that from a supply chain side back to business benefits? So the conversations we're having with our brand partners at the moment, because we see the benefits from their side, be that mitigating risks, be that building consumer trust. But for us, we're saying, well, how does that benefit back to us as a business? How do we link sourcing and sustainability and compliance together so that there's a rating for your suppliers whereby, if you're an A-star supplier, therefore more business should come to us because there's a recognition for the investments and the efforts that we're putting into becoming, a socially compliant, above and beyond, and an A-star environmental company as well. And I think fashion brands still have a way to go to get there, but I think it's an interesting discourse that the fashion industry is having, especially as regulations are sort of really impacting the industry as well. So the piece around that sort of competitive advantage just resonated with me because it's a pertinent topic of conversation with our brands at the moment, and one I had about 2 weeks ago with some brand partners of ours when I was in Jordan.
Absolutely, and what you say about consumer trust, that's a key point as well in this particular conversation. Let's move things on to some of the challenges, though, because there are so many challenges that businesses face when trying to make a truly sustainable supply chain. It is not easy. There are so many moving parts. What challenges do you all see? Kanish, I'll start with you. Your thoughts. What are those biggest challenges and how can some of those be solved?
I think one of the biggest challenge would be overcoming psychological barrier. an overarching belief that sustainability is something which is not integral to business. It's an afterthought which has been plugged later on. It's extremely costly. So if you go and try to make your business sustainable, you're going to end up incurring huge costs. But I must clarify, it's a myth, both in our experience and in general, what we've seen around. So that's definitely, it's one of the first, barriers that we've come across in our engagement on sustainable supply chain. Another that we see is unnecessary complexity, which is introduced into the conversation, by means of jargonizations, by using super complex terms, not really identifying the segment to whom we are targeting the conversation. Now, what we see often are two extremes. On one side, we have experts who are academically brilliant. They have extremely sound technical knowledge, but often they have an inability to moderate their conversation to reach the level of a person who is running a factory or running a business. And sustainability is not really their day-to-day conversation or area of work. So we need to de-jargonize the conversation and make it relatable to these individuals and people who are actually responsible for doing things on ground. And on the other hand, we have people who are extremely sound business professionals, but often they do not have enough exposure to the topics of sustainability. Or actually, the sweet spot is when we have the overlap of people who are conversant with the technical nuances of the various concepts, various issues, the challenges, as well as they can speak the business language and make it relatable to the people who are actually responsible for implementing actions on ground. So that, I would say, is the second biggest challenge that I've come across. And finally, I would say inability to find out workable solutions for some of the complex challenges of our times is definitely one of the key barriers that we see. The legacy business practices, they are there for generations. They've evolved, with a particular approach and mindset and consideration. And sustainability somehow was not in the midst of the things when these considerations were being looked at. If we have to incorporate sustainability, we have to relook at those things. We have to revisit some of the traditional business, let's say, fundamentals, the way we look at our business activities, our supply chains. And unfortunately, this requires a little bit of out-of-box thinking. So I would say these are the three challenges. And if you're able to overcome these, and it's not like these are not feasible or not possible, in several of our supplier programs, we've overcome these. I think the responsibility is a lot on people like us who are around in this panel and our audience to take action on these points and come up with workable solutions which can make sustainable supply chains a reality. Finding out solutions is, I think, one of the biggest barriers that we are facing today.
Absolutely agree on the importance of taking responsibility there at the end. That's a really, really good point. Maureen, if I can come to you next on those challenges.
Again, I loved Kanish's points. He's a great person to follow on this. I think there's a key element around how we build capability in our suppliers. So I've worked with a wonderful client in this over the last few years, and sort of their product is for children. So we're very focused on their long-term impact. And they kicked off their work on sustainable supply chains by it was during COVID, so a big virtual roundtable with their CEO and all of their client CEOs saying, this is why this really matters to us. And I went, oh, right, we understand. And then 2 or 3 years later, they did their carbon inventory and nothing had really changed. And it turned out basically their suppliers knew it mattered, but didn't quite know what to do. So the work we did with them was to work through their different categories of suppliers. We segmented them into 8 different types of materials. For each of those supply taxonomies, we built a detailed playbook going, if you're in textiles, these are the 23 different levers you can pull to drive down your carbon. And if, by the way, you're based in France, these are the ways you can get your hands-on, you can shift to sustainable energy. So an absolute tailored playbook per category and per region. And then each category planner sat with the key suppliers in that area and said, okay, so this is what we would expect for carbon intensity in your industry. This is what you're reporting. These are the 10 things you could do. I'd like you to go away and discuss internally and come back and tell me which 3 of them you're implementing first. So it was incredibly pragmatic, and it was focused on upskilling them, enabling them, both helping my client get to their own carbon guidelines, but as we talked about, that impact multiplier. So for me, that was a really powerful example.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maureen. And speaking of textiles, that's a wonderful time to bring Claire in. Your thoughts on those challenges?
Yeah, I think, again, some really pertinent points raised that are relevant to things that keep me awake at night at the moment. I think, we own actually a lot of our supply chain. We have 15 owned manufacturing sites based in the Middle East from a garment manufacturing perspective. And I think one of the challenges I see sort of internally is we have a very diverse team member base, right? So we have about 16,000 team members, 75% female, migrant workforce in Jordan, where you're looking at India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, all with differing levels of literacy. So the first thing that we start with is, well, actually, how do we translate being sustainable in our own supply chain to our own team members? How do we communicate that? Because, a big corporate presentation isn't going to work to our team members on the production floor. And we talk about being a purpose-driven business. We talk about making fashion fit for the future. Now, those at the coalface, so to speak, how do we energize them and motivate them to understand what we're all trying to achieve? Because we can achieve more through our own supply chain a lot more quickly and move the needle than we can necessarily in our not in our supply chain in China, for example, where we don't own our mill partners. So I think that is an internal challenge that we face, and how do we build sustainability into KPIs to motivate people as well, working hand in hand with our HR business partners. And I think capability building in our own supply chain, to Maureen's point, that's a really important one for us at the moment, especially with our mill partners in China. Data is certainly king in our industry at the moment. Everyone's looking to collect data. We've found challenges where we go and ask for the data, and our mill partners, they don't understand why we want the data. They don't want to give us the data. And so we've had to kind of go back to the drawing board and say, right, we need to start with educating and engaging more with our mill partners, turning it from a sort of transactional relationship into one of more of a partnership, where we're really working hand in hand with them to educate, to allow them to understand the regulations that we're facing, which ultimately is going to trickle down into China if they want to work with suppliers like us, who work with brands like Lululemon and Under Armour and North Face, who are all facing these pressures as well. So I think that's something that we're really working to unpick at the moment, as well, of course, obviously the cost versus the ROI and the pressure that the fashion supply chain is certainly facing in terms of making investments from our brand partners, where we then look at sort of saying, well, how do we sustainably afford to make all of these sustainable changes as well? So I think there are sort of 3 key challenges that we are certainly facing at the moment.
Thank you. And the talk there about suppliers is something I'm going to come back to in just a moment. So hold that thought for a moment if you can, Claire. Kelsey, I'll come to you last, though, on the challenges, though.
Quickly, for us as a state-owned government business, we focus very heavily on contracting local vendors. They're not always very well resourced in the administration space, as their larger counterparts on the mainland or internationally. So to meet our compliance obligations, we're placing increasing expectations on our suppliers to complete things like questionnaires, share their policies and procedures, which a company that employs 10 people, say, just isn't resourced to accommodate. This can create both cost and compliance implications for our vendors. So we're very much hands-on in our approach as far as education, training, and what we can do to support our local vendors so they can continue tendering with us. But then they're also well placed, I guess, within that sustainability environment as well for future tenders.
Thank you, Kelsey. And again, that really backs up where I want to go to next. The questions from the audience, thank you so much, are flooding in. And I did want to talk about suppliers later on. Well, this question is phrased far better than I could have done. How do you ensure suppliers have sustainable practices? Maureen, I'll start with you on this one. How do you advise on that? How do you actually go about trying to tap into that and making sure suppliers have sustainable practices? Your thoughts, Maureen?
I think an element, a mix of carrot and stick. Obviously, like anything else, you hold your suppliers accountable to. You do need the contracts, you do need the audits, you do need the enforcement mechanisms, you do need the reporting. I'm a big fan of using platforms like, for example, EcoVadis, where where your suppliers don't have to report 15 times, but you have those external certifications. So that's sort of your compliance part. And then the other part is back to what we said earlier on, how are you going to build their capability? As Claire mentioned, when you ask them to report, they often go, what, why, how? So you often have to do carbon accounting training or connect them to one of the big platforms. So it's how you invest in their capability, and then also how you audit and track. So I believe the line was, in God we trust, everyone else we audit.
That is an expression that I would like printed on a mug very soon. Claire, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And obviously speaking from the supply chain side, it's a major challenge in the fashion industry. The mention of audits, it's such a heavily audited industry, which actually I think can get in the way, given it's expensive, it's time consuming. In Jordan last year, we have 3 facilities there. We faced 40 audits alone. So that gives you 12 weeks a year to actually look at how you create some meaningful change for the industry. And I think from a supply chain side, in terms of how do you make sure your supply chain is doing good, I think setting up a partnership with your supply chain, not a sort of transactional brand or business and supply chain relationship is really key, because the more we feel we can be transparent with our brand partners and the more we can say, look, progress, not perfection. These are the things that we're doing right. We're on a cycle of continuous improvement. We want to learn. We want to do better. We would like some help here. What do you think about this? The more you can have these kind of dialogues, the more we can share the things that, okay, we've had a serious grievance over here. This is how we're investigating it. This is what we're doing from a social compliance standpoint. And the more you can have that partnership approach to the point of a bit more carrot and maybe a bit less stick, I think for us that's important. And again, very sort of relevant conversations that we're having with our brand partners at the moment. And I'm really enjoying the work we're doing with brands like Under Armour in Jordan, because that's the type of relationship that we're moving into with them, where it's a lot more transparent from our side, because there's that level of trust that we have between each other as well.
Yeah, that transparency is absolutely key. Kelsey, I'll come to you next about making sure your suppliers are adopting those sustainable practices. How do you go about that at Tas Networks?
Sure. Well, we are an extremely heavily regulated industry, and there's some pretty big ramifications if things do go awry, as far as community response and media also in our situation. So it's about how do we make sustainability a priority for our business, our community, and our suppliers. Primarily, did mention earlier, a lot of that is being done at the moment through training and capacity building directly one-on-one with our suppliers, providing them that knowledge. And even if it's not directly impacting the way that they do their work, maybe they can take a message away with them, the workers, in fact, back into the local community and educate others that may be entering the workforce here in Australia.
Thank you, Kelsey. Kanishk, if I come to you last on this one, on those supplier relationships and making sure that they are adopting sustainable practice.
Certainly, and I cannot agree more with my fellow panelists. It's a combination of everything. You have carrot and sticks, you have partnerships. I think it's extremely, extremely important that we have to be in the trenches with our suppliers while we are asking them to adopt sustainable practices. It won't work if you're armchair generals and trying to, keep an arm's length distance and say, okay, this is what you need to do, get it done, and then ask me how, etc. So I think that is a mindset that we definitely need to overcome. Another area is finding solutions, because some of the challenges that our suppliers are facing, that's a byproduct of a legacy business practices. Somehow situations and things have evolved that we've ended up with these well practices being accepted as part of the normal business scenario. Now, if we leave it alone to the suppliers, I don't think it's justified. We have to invest our time, our resources, our expertise, sharing the experiences and the best practices to look at these challenges with a new lens and come up with workable solutions. Some of the work that we did with our suppliers on decarbonization, on human rights, are a testimony to that. It really gives results. And when the supplier sees you as a customer, sitting with them, trying to figure out a solution jointly, it certainly gives a much more serious cover to the entire exercise, rather than just sending a requirement to the supplier and asking them to comply. And lastly, I would say embedding it into the governance of the procurement organization is extremely critical. Suppliers, let's say they take the voice of the buyer seriously, the person who clears the invoices, who clears the bills, who's actually releasing orders to them. Now, if sustainability is not part of the business reviews or the scorecards that procurement organization has it, which means procurement hasn't really bought in to those commitments, to those initiatives. And if procurement is not on board, it will reflect in the communication or the way it goes out, the message goes out to the suppliers. And suppliers are smart. They'll realize it's not as important, for those set of people who really matter to me for my business. And hence, we will see the reflection in their actions as well. So 3 parts: being with them, finding out solutions, making sure we are communicating with very clear and precise terms the expectations and the repercussions, and finally embedding it into the governance of the procurement, so that if there is a performance or lack of it, it doesn't go ignored, it doesn't go, let's say, sideways, and it's taken into account to take the supplier ahead into the business life cycle.
Ganesh, I couldn't agree more, and I love how you've approached that. Being in the trenches with them, it's a partnership. If all you do is send diktats down the supply chain towards them, you're not going to get much collaboration there. Time is running out rapidly, so I'm going to finish on one last question here. And Claire, I'll start with you on this if I can. The old understanding was sustainable supply chains are more expensive to implement. I guess that might be something that is becoming increasingly in the past. But for you, how can you manage those costs of making sure there's the commitment to sustainable practice and everything that comes with that, whilst managing those costs at the same time? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, the cost of sustainability is one of my favourite topics to debate. And again, I think that whole working with your supply chain and partnership is really important. I was at the OECD conference in Paris back in February, and I was having a really interesting conversation with another supply chain partner for the sort of fashion and apparel industry, where actually they're a great example of working in partnership with their brand partners, where they're using data science to work with their brands to look at how they can then strip back costs in other parts of their business which relate to them. So perhaps not over-ordering on stock, reducing, the number of garments they're ordering, so they can then use this money to reinvest that back into the supply chain. So they're not actually costing their brand partners any more money. They're just looking at how they can create those efficiencies for their brand partners, whilst also then benefiting their brands back, investing back into the supply chain as well. And I loved that idea, and I think that's something that the rest of certainly the fashion industry can learn from as well, using that sort of data science point. I think when it comes to the democratization of sustainability, working closely with our brand partners, we are often coming up with new innovations, which, at the start of their life cycle can appear to be more expensive. A textile to textile recycled polyester versus a virgin polyester. Yes, off the outset, that's going to be more expensive, and brands are asking us for prices at, cost neutral, if you like. But I think a great example was our work with Walmart, where we were able to work with them enough in advance. They were able to give us enough commitment where we could then launch what we called Green Fuse Circle, which was this textile to textile recycled polyester with their sort of high fashion brand free assembly. We were able to make it at an affordable cost because they gave us that commitment in advance, so we could leverage our sort of scale, if you like, to make that affordable to them. And where other premium brands are sort of saying, oh, we don't think we can afford this, we could launch it with a brand which is obviously a very accessible brand like Walmart. So, I think, again, that partnership, working in advance and looking at where perhaps cost savings can come from other parts of the business to help fund sustainability is really important.
That's a really strong example. Thank you, Claire. Kelsey, quickly come to you on this about managing those costs.
Sure. From personal experience, having only been in this space for a short while, I really wish I had a more holistic view of requirements, sustainability requirements, reporting obligations, so that we didn't attack this space in a piecemeal fashion, because I think you've only got limited funding, limited resources to support this kind of work. Just a bit of a long-term visibility, I think, would have been really supportive in keeping the costs down, in setting up reporting, monitoring, and working with our vendors in this space.
Thank you, Kelsey. Kanishk, if I can come to you briefly on this, please.
Sure, Neil. And, I could say to begin with, it's a myth to state that sustainable supply chains are more expensive to implement. We have had instances where suppliers have achieved, on an average, 40% reduction in their intensity of Scope 1, Scope 2, without really incurring any significant financial adversity. Even in instances where, let's say, the traditional suppliers, when you are implementing certain renewable instruments, you would have to book the investments in your own accounts. We were able to identify third parties and come up with arrangements where the third party booked all the expenses, and we were able to transform the typical traditional CapEx investment into an OpEx, plug and play kind of investment. So absolutely no cost to the supplier, just beyond, the consumption of the usage of renewable electricity. So I think the onus is a lot on corporations like us to figure out innovative solutions to overcome the cost barrier. I mean, one of the ways that we arranged was to have sustainable supply chain finance. So we had an arrangement with a financial institution through our procurement finance colleagues, wherein the suppliers who were demonstrating performance above a certain threshold, on one of our sustainability initiatives in one of the pilot countries, they received the payment almost immediately. Well, as against the traditional payment terms or the number of days that you have, 60, 90, whatever. And this meant a lot to them because it reduced the cost of capital that they needed for running their business. And likewise, there are several instances where companies will save money by approaching sustainability in a structured and a streamlined manner. Of course, I'm not saying that at no point there will be costs. There will certainly be costs, but it will come probably much later. And even when it comes, at least in our own experience of Schneider Electric, because we've done a lot of, what we are teaching our suppliers within our own facilities, the usual discipline of financial decision will always be there. So, never you'll have an instance where you will have, let's say, going beyond the traditional rate of return for making any financial decision. If you're facing with such, that means we're not looking at the right solution. We need to go back to the drawing board and come up with solutions which actually work in a practical and tangible manner.
Kanishk, thank you very much. And Maureen, I'll give you the final word.
Excellent. So I agree with the points made. It's about being innovative. It's about being creative. As Claire said, those longer lead times and make sensible trade-offs and decisions. And sometimes there is an investment, but as Kanishk said, it's about what is the ROI over a longer term. So say sustainable aviation fuel. Right now, that is a little more expensive, but there's not that much of it available. So if you get in there now, you may pay a premium now, but you're then future-proofing yourself with the supply of that when the carbon taxes kick in. So if you take an overall business ownership view, you may take a slightly longer return on investment, but you can still make some really sensible decisions that will benefit your business financially as well as from a sustainability point of view.
Okay, Maureen, thank you very much indeed. Well, I've barely scratched the surface of the questions I wanted to get through. I've barely scratched the surface of the questions that came in. We could have carried on for another half an hour quite easily. But Maureen, Kanishk, Kelsey and Claire, thank you so much for joining me. And Claire, I just need to reference the mirror behind you. I keep on feeling like there's going to be a face appearing telling us who's the fairest or most sustainable of them all. It just needs to be referenced. You can tell you work in fashion. Thank you so much for joining us here at Sustainability Live Singapore. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.